everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. Well, thanks to all of you for being here. It's great to see you, and particularly a number of folks I haven't seen for a long time. It's nice to see your faces again. The presentation that I'm going to give this afternoon draws on themes that I raised in the July issue of Anthropology News. I imagine that a number of you have already seen that article. And it will preview some points that I am planning to address in a session at next month's AAA meeting that's being organized by Jim Weil. I'm going to look at my work on the Polynesian island of Anuta over the past half century, how I got there, the themes uniting my diverse topics of interest, and how academic research led to community engagement. And I guess I'm going to try to bring up my slideshow here.
It is, it's there.
How is that? Can you all see it?
Can you click
Yep.
full? There you go, full screen.
You said that I should or should not do full screen.
Yeah.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay, good. Okay, so the story of my interest in anthropology and ultimately my connection to Anuta goes back to my childhood, to my early childhood. My grandparents on both sides immigrated from Europe, and I remember as a very young child listening to stories about life in what they called the old country. I spent a lot of time with my maternal grandparents, and I remember many times sitting on my grandpa's knee. My maternal grandparents only lived about a mile away from my parents and me, so I was able to spend a lot of time there. And my grandfather would read nursery rhymes and fairy tales like Cinderella and Hansel and Gretel. And as I was listening, it struck me that something was very wrong. I was bothered, for example, by the depiction of Cinderella on her hands and knees, scrubbing floors and wearing rags, and needing help from her fictitious fairy godmother, while her lazy stepmother and exploitative stepsisters were invited to the royal ball. During the 1950s, when I was still quite a young child, I remember my parents and grandparents talking about the importance of human equality and mutual respect. When I got to grade school, I learned about the American Revolution and the foundational documents of our country. I was taken by such expressions as all men are created equal from the Declaration of Independence, and the idea of free speech and freedom of religion as laid out in the Bill of Rights. By the late 1950s, the civil rights movement had picked up full speed, and I became emotionally and eventually, in terms of action, attached to the civil rights movement. But there was a second strand to my development, and that involves a commitment to and appreciation of the out of doors. My dad was a gifted athlete, and he loved being in the woods, camping. He was very much interested in aquatic activities, swimming, paddling, fishing, sailing, and that became a second major strand influencing my development. In the early 1960s, I was probably in junior high school at the time. It was shortly after the Cuban Revolution, after the Bay of Pigs invasion, but before the Cuban Missile Crisis. I happened to pick up a book by the sociologist C. Wright Mills called Listen Yankee, and I became exposed to the idea that the animosity that was all around between Cuba and the United States didn't come out of nowhere, that there was a long history of interaction between the two countries, and that the animosity many Cubans felt to the United States, as put forth by C. Wright Mills, came out of what we today would call a history of neocolonialism and exploitation. I was also interested and concerned about world peace, even at that age. And as I was digesting the lessons of Listen Yankee, I came to the realization that if we were ever going to have genuine world peace, it would have to be built on a more just world, a more equitable distribution of resources among the people of the world. So that brings me to the 1960s, when I was in high school looking for a place to pursue undergraduate studies. I also, during my years in high school, was more and more committed to the civil rights movement. I joined the Queens, New York chapter of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. I remember going to tutor African-American students in the South Jamaica ghetto. But still, that second strand, the aquatic strand, the outdoors strand of my upbringing was important. And when I was in junior high and high school, I was thinking seriously about a career in marine biology. In fact, even when I started college, I was thinking that marine biology might be the way that I was going to go. But then in 1964, when I was trying to decide where to apply for my undergraduate studies, the free speech movement in Berkeley, California broke out. The FSM was an offshoot of the civil rights movement. And by coincidence, the leader of the FSM was a man named Mario Savio, a name that some of you may remember.
Yes.
By coincidence, was an alumnus of my high school, Martin Van Buren High School in Queens. In fact, a few years before I graduated, he was the high school valedictorian. I was inspired by the FSM. I applied to UC Berkeley for my undergraduate studies. I was accepted there. I arrived in fall of 1965 and quickly became involved in student activism at Berkeley. I was still struggling with the question of what I wanted to do for a career. I was interested in marine biology, and that's a topic that continues to interest me today. But as I thought about ways that I might make a meaningful difference in the world, it occurred to me that the greatest challenge facing humankind might not be how we relate to the natural world, but how human beings relate to one another. And so I started drifting more and more in the direction of the social sciences. I wanted a career that would make a difference, but it also struck me that some of the most brilliant minds in the history of humankind had been dealing with the same kinds of problems we were facing in the 1960s, and I have to say many of the same problems that we face today. Problems of war, of crime, of corruption, of discrimination, of oppression, of exploitation, and the list goes on. And who was I to think that I might be able to come up with ideas that were more path-breaking than what had been offered by the likes of Plato, Aristotle, John Locke, Montesquieu, and the list goes on. But as I was thinking about that, it struck me that maybe one of the reasons that these people were never able to resolve the problems facing us in spite of their brilliance was that they were all stuck in a Western mindset. Maybe, I thought, if I learned how people outside of the Western tradition thought about these issues and addressed some of the same problems that we address here, I might gain some insights that could help me and help the people around me take a different path to resolving some of these issues. With all of this in mind, in my freshman year at Berkeley, I took a class by Jerry Berriman, The Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. I quickly learned that there was already an academic discipline that was doing exactly what I had in mind. And I decided then and there that I wanted to devote my career to cultural anthropology. Initially, I was thinking that I'd focus on China as my place of ethnographic interest. But when I got to graduate school at the University of Chicago, I was thinking about doing field work. The idea that one might have to spend a year, two, maybe even more than that, in the place where I was going to do my graduate studies. And it might as well be a place that I would really enjoy, which is where, well, getting a little ahead of myself there, where the second aspect of my upbringing came into the picture. It occurred to me that as a that if I focused on the Pacific Islands rather than on China, I would still be dealing with a tradition that was very different from anything that I had experienced growing up or as a resident of the United States. It also occurred to me that I would be able to spend a lot of time out of doors in a relatively pristine environment, that I would be able to spend a good deal of time near, on, and even in or under the water. And it just seemed too good an opportunity to pass up. So I shifted my intended focus of research from China to the Pacific Islands. I also had some funding to do field research for my master's as well as my doctoral work. And I had for an advisor the one faculty member at the University of Chicago at the time who had actually done field research in the Pacific. That was Schneider, who worked on Yap in Micronesia. So I to David about where I should go for my field research for my master's. And I suggested that maybe I could go out to the Pacific somewhere. He discouraged me from doing that. He said, you know, you've never been in that part of the world before. It's far away. Many of these places are hard to get to. And if things started to go wrong, it would be hard to get back home. So he had an alternative suggestion. He thought of a doctoral student of his named Gary Witherspoon, who I just recently learned passed away a few months ago. But Gary had lived with the Navajo for about a decade before going to graduate school. He was planning to go back out to the reservation as soon as his doctoral defense had been completed, which was going to be very soon. And David thought that maybe Gary would be willing to give me some guidance, to hook me up with a host family, to help me adjust to life on the Navajo reservation. Gary was agreeable, and it seemed like a good idea to me. So I took a bit of a detour to the American Southwest. The result was a very rewarding summer in 1970. I enjoyed my time with the Navajo. I was adopted into the family I stayed with, and in fact, I'm still in contact with members of that family today. So I don't at all regret that detour. I wrote a few articles and a monograph based on that master's research, but I haven't really done any ongoing research with the Navajo. I did return to Chicago in fall of 1970 to write up my my master's paper. And at that point, a second fortuitous event occurred. Raymond Firth, later to be Sir Raymond Firth, was a visiting professor at the University of Chicago. You're probably aware that Raymond is known for his pioneering field work on the island of Tikopia, a Polynesian island in the southeastern Solomons, going back to the 1920s. I enrolled in a couple of Raymond's classes and had a number of conversations with him about where I should go for my doctoral research. In one of those conversations, I particularly recall that he said, almost in these exact words, "I don't think that Tikopia is quite ready for an exhaustive restudy quite yet. But you know of this other island. It's called Anuta. It's even smaller and more remote than Tikopia. It's Tikopia's nearest neighbor. And if you're looking for an isolated island, Anuta is as isolated as they come. So you might want to think about that and check into it." Well, I don't think I used the expression isolated, but that was his interpretation of my wanting a place that was relatively unacculturated and could stand in contrast with the Western world. I did think about it. I contacted some of the relevant people. One thing led to another. And in February of 1972, I left Chicago for a year and a half in the Southwestern Pacific. I arrived on Anuta in March of 1972. And one of the very first things that happened was that I was told that the chief wanted me to stay in the household of his younger brother, Putokarau. That was a very good decision on the chief's part for a number of reasons. Probably most importantly, that Putoke at that time was the only person living on Anuta who spoke fairly competent English. In addition to being the chief's brother, he was also the island's catechist. The island had been affiliated with the Anglican Church since 1916. And I ended up then living in a one-room leaf house with Putoke and his wife. We shared food, we shared other resources, and this was a basic way of incorporating me into the community. I didn't find an earthly paradise when I got to Anuta. There were plenty of disagreements, rumors, suspicion, just as you would find pretty much anywhere. But people were enormously kind, considerate, and supportive, and they introduced me to the notion of aropa. Aropa is the Anutan version of a pan-Polynesian concept. The version that you're probably most familiar with is the Hawaiian word aloha. Hawaii is the aloha state. Aloha or aropa means something like love or empathy or compassion, but not just as an internal state, as something that is expressed through material acts of giving or sharing. So by living in Putoke's house, by sharing food and other resources, we were expressing aropa for one another. And before long, Putoke started to refer to me as his taina. Taina means approximately brother. And since I was Putoke's brother, and Putoke was the brother of the senior chief, that also made me the brother of the senior chief. I was interested in the study of kinship, and I talked with Putoke and the chief and a number of other people about that. And they insisted that my position as the chief's taina, the chief's brother, was not simply metaphorical, but that it was literal. I recall pressing the chief on that a bit. I suggested the hypothetical situation in which I went back to America, I got married, I had a son, and I asked him, would that then put my son potentially in the line of succession to the chieftainship? And the answer was, very much to my surprise, yes, it would. However, he also had no thought that I would ever be able to test that proposition. So I just more or less took him at his word for the time being. In 1973, I went back to Chicago to write up my dissertation. Since that time, I've been back to Anuta on a number of occasions. The first opportunity that I had to return was in 1983, when I went back with my wife and 2 children, and we spent about a year in the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, much of that time with people from Anuta, and part of that time on the island of Anuta itself. I've tried to maintain contact with people from Anuta in the 1970s and 80s. It was pretty difficult because there was no way of communicating other than brief paper letters, which depended on ships visiting Anuta and then the postal service in the Solomon Islands and the United States. It's become a little easier over the last couple of decades with internet communication. There are a few Anutans living in the national and provincial capital who have access to the internet, so I can find out a certain amount through email and Facebook about what's going on much more quickly than I used to. My doctoral research was focused on kinship. Kinship is connected to the notion of aropa. Aropa is the foundational concept that underlies the Newton morality or ethics. It underlies the social system. It underlies the cultural system in any number of ways. So by studying kinship and studying Aropa, I became connected to a number of other issues. One is that by trying to learn about Anutan kinship, I had to learn the language. In one sense, of course, I just had to learn the language simply to live there because there was only one competent English speaker at the time. But as I became more and more conversant with the Anutan language, I became more tuned in to the discussions going on in historical linguistics. There had been a little bit written about Anutan linguistics at the time in the early 1970s. And the people who were involved in these conversations pretty much had come to the conclusion that, well, historical linguistics has been for a long time a fundamental tool for the reconstruction of patterns of migration, settlement, and prehistory in Polynesia. And the people writing about this contended that there was a disconnect between the linguistic evidence of Anuta and what the oral traditions said about the origins of the Anutan population. As I learned more about the language and about oral traditions, it became clear to me that these conclusions were based on a number of faulty understandings. One is that there was a fundamental misunderstanding of the Anutan language and where it came from. A second was a misunderstanding of the oral traditions themselves. So that led me to look more systematically at the language, at collecting oral traditions. I've written a number of articles about the subject. In 1977, I published an Anutan dictionary, which is available on academia.edu, and over the years has probably been the item on academia.edu that's been cited more than anything else. But I also published a book of Anutan oral traditions with Oxford University Press in 1999 in the Anutan language with English translations and pretty detailed annotations, going back to this question of just what the oral traditions say about Anutan origins and the support that it really gets from the information that we have or that I had about the Anutan language. The notion of Aropa and kinship also led to an interest in politics and religion. Leadership on Anuta is based, as it is in most of Polynesia, on genealogical rank. Genealogical rank is connected to spiritual power. That spiritual power is a notion that you find throughout Polynesia and, in fact, beyond Polynesia around the Pacific. It's typically called by the term mana, and generally for Polynesians, one is expected to have mana in proportion to one's genealogical seniority. So the person with the greatest genealogical seniority is the person with the greatest spiritual power, and that person is then expected to use that power to ensure the well-being of the island and the people living on the island. In that way, the chief, who has more spiritual power, more mana than anybody else, shows his Aropa for the people underneath him by ensuring their well-being. In turn, the chief's followers show their Aropa to the chief And in that case, it's perhaps best translated as gratitude by showing the chief ritual honor, respect, and following the chief's directives. So interest in kinship and language also led to an interest in politics and religion, and also to medicine or medical anthropology. It didn't take me very long on Anuta before I started hearing people talk about cases of illness, accident, and death being attributed to spiritual misbehavior. Essentially, the idea is that if you don't treat somebody with superior mana, with the appropriate honor and respect, something bad is likely to happen to you. So this is in turn connected to medicine, or it connects medicine to politics, to kinship, to genealogy, and to religion. Then that second string to my upbringing comes in. My interest in aquatic activities also has led to an interest in voyaging, navigation, and spatial cognition. And I think that that's probably the area in which I've made my greatest contribution to Pacific anthropology. But my work on all of these topics has led to an ongoing connection to the community, and also has led in a number of unexpected directions. One goes back to that conversation that I had with the chief back in 1972 about my status as the chief's brother and whether or not that would put my in the line of succession to the chieftainship. I didn't think that I would ever have the opportunity to test what the chief insisted was true about that, but as it turns out, I did in a way. The chief had one son, but he passed away without having any offspring. The chief has had three biological brothers, and none of them had any children. So that technically should have put my son in the line of succession to the chieftainship. Now, we're not exactly looking for a paramount chief at this point, because the man who was chief in 1972 is still alive and carrying out those duties. But people on Anuta, especially people connected to the chief, have had a real interest in bringing Joe, my son, out there. And in fact, during the 1990s and early 2000s, they spent about a decade lobbying with him to come out to Anuta so that he could be installed into a chiefly position. That is easier said than done. Anuta is still extraordinarily isolated, but in 2008, I was going out to the Solomon Islands for a study of a different Polynesian island in the same province as Anuta. Joe came with me. He waited in the provincial capital, Lata, for about 3 months for a ship, and then was able to get out to Anuta for just 1 day. If he didn't go back on the same ship, he would have had to wait probably for another 3 months for the next ship. And he had a significant other waiting for him in Chicago who probably would not have been very happy about that. So he only stayed for a few hours, but that was enough to have this, this ceremony performed. I was on Taumako. I was not on Anuta, so I didn't actually see this, but later on, people shared these photographs with me, and I was able eventually to talk with people from Anuta who had been at the ceremony, and they assured me that, yes, he really was installed as a chief. It's kind of unconventional because there is already a chief serving in that position. Besides, Joe has his own life, his own family, he has a job. It's very unlikely that he's going to be moving out to Anuta on a basis. And the idea of there being a paramount chief who is not living on the island is a little strange. But people did insist that he now is an Ariki. And when I asked for an explanation of just what that means, they suggested that he's sort of like a foreign minister. His job is to represent the community to the outside world, so that, for example, if there is a group that wants to go to Anuta to make a documentary film, he is the one they're supposed to contact and negotiate terms and ultimately decide whether or not they can go. He's supposed to be on the lookout for development opportunities. And he was asked to create a community website, which he has done. And the address, if anyone is interested, of the website is up on the screen. The other unexpected direction involves what I've called the Anuta Scholarship Fund. This, in a way, goes back to the 1970s. After I left Anuta for the first time, periodically people would get in touch with me and ask me for support of one kind or another. They would ask for money to buy food for a ceremony, or to buy supplies, or for transport, or for something of that sort. And I would oblige to the extent that I could, but it bothered me that this was all being done on an individual ad hoc basis. I wanted to be able to do something that would show the community at large my feelings of indebtedness to them. And when I was on Anuta in 2000, I had a chance to really explore this issue with people who were there. It occurred to me that Anuta more and more would be dealing with the outside world. And to be able to deal with the outside world effectively, it was going to be necessary to have some degree of Western education. That is difficult in a place like Anuta. Even today, the school only goes through standard 6, or more or less the equivalent of 6th grade. So if anyone wants to continue his or her education beyond 6th grade, that person has to go to a school on a different island. That means not only paying school fees, but paying for transportation, for food, and for lodging. And in a place like Anuta, where there's very limited access to cash, it's difficult to get enough money to support students for doing that. It also occurred to me that in a place like the Solomon Islands, a relatively small amount of money could go a long way. So I suggested the possibility of creating a small scholarship fund to help young people who are facing that dilemma. I got back to the provincial, or the national capital, Honiara, set up a bank account, set up some guidelines for the fund's operation. I wanted to avoid a paternalistic system. I wanted the Anutans to be able to make the basic decisions for themselves. So we created a committee of 3 leading individuals in Honiara who would have access to the bank account. The way the system was supposed to work initially was that there would be a group of people on Anuta who were connected to the school, who could then recommend a group of students who seemed especially promising, the schools that they wanted to attend. That list would be forwarded to the committee in Honiara. The committee would then access the bank account and transfer the necessary funds to the schools. As far as I could tell, for the first few years, everything was working fairly smoothly. But in 2006, I got a rude awakening. There was a team from BBC in the UK who were going out to the Solomon Islands to make a documentary about Anuta. And they asked me what they could do to show their appreciation to the community. I suggested a donation to the scholarship fund. They got to Honiara, they suggested that, and were immediately told, no, don't do that. As it happens, there were a lot of people in the community who suspected one prominent member of the committee of accessing the bank account and using the funds for his own personal benefit. So that led to a great deal of anger, animosity, division, just the kind of thing that I was trying to avoid. And in fact, the opposite of what I was hoping the scholarship fund would accomplish. The following year, in 2007, I went out to the Solomons for the study of Talmako and had a chance to spend some time with the Anutan community to talk about the situation. It was clear that there was not any support for the scholarship fund as it was operating at that point. And we talked about somebody who might be trusted to take over the administration of the fund. Eventually, there was an agreement that it could be given to the Anglican Diocese of Tuamotu, Tuamotu Province. And I was able to talk with the Bishop of Tuamotu. He agreed, people on Anuta agreed, and it seemed that the fund was now in good hands. I was in the Solomons until December of 2007. Then I went back to the States for a few months. In 2008, I went back to the Solomons and I learned that the fund still wasn't working, that the schools that the students were attending had not been paid, that they were in danger of being expelled for non-payment of tuition. And I had the opportunity to do some investigation into what was going on. I discovered that the bishop had turned administration of the fund over to his secretary, and the diocese secretary was really concerned that the funds from the bank account not be misused in any way. So he took the bank book and locked it in the diocese safe and then lost the key. So no one could access the bank book for any reason whatsoever. No one could access the bank account for any reason. And the young people's tuition was not being paid. As a result of all this, I ended up doing something I didn't really want to do, but I didn't see an alternative. I closed the bank account in Honiara, transferred the funds to an account in the US. I took over administration of the fund, which in some ways worked reasonably well, but there were logistical difficulties there too. Initially, what would happen is that I would receive a list of students and schools. I'd write a check with a cover letter to the headmaster of the school about who is supposed to be supported, to what extent, in what ways, and then I'd put it in the mail. The problem there was that it can take a couple of weeks for letters to get to the Solomon's capital. And the schools themselves are likely to be in pretty remote areas, so it might take many more weeks or even months for the check and the letter to get from Honiara to the schools. Then, since the schools are in remote areas, they are probably not going to be close to a bank, so the check couldn't be cashed until the headmaster or somebody representing the headmaster could get back to the national capital and go to a bank. By that time, it might be several months, and the checks would be stale dated. They couldn't be cashed, and the process starts over again. Eventually, we were able to come up with a bit of a makeshift solution. There was one family in Honiara, one Anutan family that was widely trusted, and they agreed to have me wire funds via Western Union to some member of the family who would then take responsibility for getting the funds over to the school. And that worked reasonably well. But there was another wrinkle. One of the members of the family, my primary conduit of communication, Mark Rongo Cavea, who is in this photo on the left, left the Solomons to attend medical school in Fiji. He was not in the country. That made it more difficult to transfer funds, but somehow we managed, and we also were able to provide some funding to help Mark and Hugh Blessing Renga, the other young man in the other photo, to complete medical school in Fiji. They did complete their degrees about 2 years ago for Mark, about a year ago for Hugh. They're back in the Solomon Islands working for the National Referral Hospital and completing their residencies. But there is one further problem which looks like it may be fatal to the scholarship fund, and that's not a problem with the Solomon Islands, it's a problem with the US. That is that we established the fund as a nonprofit organization with the thought that if donations were tax deductible, we might be able to attract donations and do a better job. But the IRS has made the process of filing tax returns more and more complicated. And recently we discovered that the tax returns have to be filed electronically, that if we want to file our tax returns to maintain our status as a nonprofit organization, we either have to purchase some very expensive software or else pay a professional consultant to prepare our tax return. Either way, it's probably going to end up costing more than what we're gaining in tax deductions and donations. So we might very well end up having to disband or to dissolve the scholarship fund and to go back to assisting people on the island on an ad hoc basis. Let me just say a couple words of conclusion. This kind of goes back to an email that you may have seen from Laura Tamakoshi earlier today about a book that she recently edited called First Fieldwork, where a number of the contributors go into the issue of what they've called reciprocal indebtedness between an anthropologist who is doing long-term field work and the community in which the anthropologist is working. Basically, what it involves is the fact that if you are going to live in a community where you're doing research, you're depending on the local people to host you, to look out for your well-being. to provide you with the information that you're going to need to have successful research and eventually to have a successful career. So as an anthropologist with a long-term commitment to a particular community, you are likely to be looking for ways to show your appreciation and to reciprocate that kindness. In my case, I've tried to repay the Anutan community by helping to preserve their valued traditions through my writing and publication, as well as photographs and sound recordings. I have tried to support their ceremonial activity to the extent that I can by providing funding for funeral expenses or for other ceremonial issues when they come up. Again, to the extent that I can and to the extent that seems reasonable. One might also provide some assistance for development projects. And in my case, this is really something that has fallen mostly to my son, Joe, and can be seen in his establishment of the community website. And then finally, through assistance with education, as we tried to do with the scholarship fund. I think that my wife, who has been working with me to administer the scholarship fund, is on this call, as well as all of you and me. So if you have questions or comments, I will try to help them, and she might be able to give a few words of wisdom as well. So with that, I thank you all for bearing with me for the past hour or so, and I'll be happy to try to answer any of your questions.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Rick. Can you stop the screen share? Yeah, great.
Done.
And so I think there's sufficiently few of us that if you want to ask a question, you can either put your question in the chat screen, or you can wave your hand and Rick can see them. If he can't, then I'll try and organize it. So does anybody have any questions? I just had a quick one to ask you. How did you, how long were you in your first and or second time? How long were you on the Anuta, and how did you get back and forth to other places? What was your itinerary in order to move from one place to another?
On that first trip?
Yeah.
On the first trip, I was waiting I arrived in early February in Honiara, what then was the colonial capital, now the national capital. I waited for about 2 weeks for a ship to Anuta. It took me about a week on the ship, including a stop at the administrative center for the Eastern Outer Islands, as they were then called. And after about another week, I guess by early March, I arrived on Anuta. I stayed there until January of 1973 and got back to Anuta, or back to Honiara by ship. And I did a certain amount of traveling through other parts of the Solomons, again, these were cargo ships, mostly about 80 to 100 feet long. Mostly we were sleeping out on the deck of the ships. Sometimes people would put fishing lines and bait in the water and troll as we were moving along. Then on the way back, I was able to stop at a number of other islands where I was able to spend a few weeks at a time. But most of that transport was by plane. The Western Pacific Archives at the time were in Suva, Fiji. So I flew to Fiji from Honiara and spent a couple of weeks there going through the archives. I was able to make stops in Tonga and Samoa on the way back. On other trips, the transport within the Solomons has actually been more complicated for various reasons. Some of them involve the fact that the Solomons became independent of the British colonial system in 1978. And there have been some problems between the people of Anuta and the national government. The national government wants to create a system of national identity and national unity. The people of Anuta have a strong feeling of independence for themselves, so they have resisted, and there's been some tension there, which has also had an effect on patient. Even today, there are sometimes only 3 or 4 ships a year that'll go out to Anuta, which is less than during the colonial period. The British administration tried to send about 1 ship a month. Sometimes it was as much as 2 or 3 months between ships, but they were usually fairly regular. Nowadays, you may very well have to wait 3 or 4 months for a ship. In other places, my most recent visit to the Pacific that was not to the Solomons, I went with a graduate student of mine to Tokelau, which is affiliated with New Zealand. It's a group of atolls north of Samoa. And what we had to do was fly to Apia, the capital of Samoa, and wait for a ship from Samoa to Tokelau. And then on the way back, we came back to Apia by ship. I guess we had to wait about a week or 2 for a ship from Samoa to Tokelau. And once we were on Tokelau, we weren't in any special rush to get back to Samoa, so we just waited until there was an opportunity to ship.
Hey, Jim Weil, you have a question. Did you want to ask it? You're muted, Jim.
Okay, I stuck it in the chat. How do the Anutans make a living? Are they largely self-sufficient and or engaged in the external economy?
The Anutans on the home island are almost entirely self-sufficient. They live by the subsistence economy. They have a very small island, but it is topographically diverse. They grow a wide variety of crops. They have they don't have a lagoon. They have a fairly narrow fringing reef, but on the fringing reef, once you get past the fringing reef, they have access to the open sea and a very elaborate system of reefs that surround the island at depths up to about 120 feet or so. I've done some work on the mental maps that people have of the seabed surrounding the island, and I published an article on the mental maps of the leading fishermen, showing something like 300 coral heads within about a 2-mile radius of the island. that are not visible unless you already know that they're there because they're very deep underwater. But they do have access to plenty of fish. They're not completely self-sufficient in the sense that they use metal fish hooks. They use monofilament fishing line. They do make their own canoes out of local materials. They make them from local trees. They bind them together with coconut sennet. But there are a few things that they depend on the cash economy for. Nowadays, they have a solar panel available for a shortwave radio that they can use to contact the provincial capital and occasionally the national capital. That I think is offered by the national government. Some individual families have people living overseas who are working for wages and send a certain amount of money or else goods back home, so that there are a few families that have their own solar panels that they use to power lights and radios. When I was first there, the only source of power they had were dry cell batteries for flashlights and kerosene for lanterns.
Thanks, Rick. I didn't know there were any traditional societies left, but if there is one, that's one.
Yeah, in many ways, but of course, the whole notion of traditional is one thing.
Fraud,
Anutans,
yes.
Anutans still are.
Scare quotes on that.
I'm sorry?
I meant to use.
I was just going to say that Anutans are devoutly Christian. They go to church twice a day, every day. But at least as of the last time that I was there, they also are concerned about ghosts and spirits that wander through the bush, and mana or manu is a very important part of their worldview. Looks like Sid.
Hey, Tony, wait, Sid, Tony had a question.
Okay, sure.
And I'll read it, Tony, or do you want to
Sure,
say?
go right ahead and read it.
Okay. Since many anthropologists are engaged with reciprocal engagements with communities that they've worked with, should there be a nonprofit clearinghouse, maybe by the AAA, for example, to manage the funds instead of each doing it on their own?
I think that would be a wonderful idea. One of the things that I've tried to do since we ran into this problem with the IRS was reach out to a number of other organizations. There's something in my local area called the Portage Foundation, and we thought that maybe they could take it over. But that's not going to work for a number of reasons. There's an organization called ASAO, the Association for Social Anthropology in Oceania. And I just in the past few days raised the possibility that they might be interested in taking over administration of the fund. But there is a problem with that in terms of their restrictions, and also the fact that we, according to the IRS, are a private foundation, and ASAO and the Portage Foundation are public entities. But if the AAA could establish something like that, I think it would be wonderful if we could be folded into a program that is operated by someone like the AAA.
You know, Ralph Bolton has Ralph Bolton and Paul Dougherty work together, and I don't know whether they did it on their own, but they have a foundation that supports some Bolivian communities
Mm,
called the Chinaya Foundation. I believe that is. I can get you the name of it. And,
okay, great.
And so I get requests from them, and they have various projects going on, and so
Uh-huh.
forth. So it's a fundraising organization as well as
Mhm.
distributing. But I think the foundation itself is located in Bolivia, but there's obviously a U.S. component to it.
Mhm.
So, but I'll get you the information.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd really appreciate it.
Okay, and Sid, go ahead.
Yeah, Rick, I take it that these people are Anglicans.
Yes, they are.
Okay. Now, what I really wanted to get to is that you intentionally chose an isolated place to do this research.
Mhm.
And that takes me back to, if I may use the term, your career has been much more traditional anthropology than most of us have been able to be engaged in. I remember Margaret Mead in the 1950s in class telling us about the ships she had to take to isolated islands and the
Mhm.
like. And it resonated really. But
Yeah.
I think your career, I wonder how many could identify, how many of us here can identify with your research career. Because, I mean, if you had worked in China, for example, I think your experience might have been more comparable to my own, where I've done research not only in the West Indies, but in Brazil, which is a huge place. And I've worked in different places. So you can't create an identity to a local population to do the kinds of things that you're involved in.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, Tony?
yeah, sure. I'm one. I mean, we were in Chicago at the same time. And I also went to one group. I've done all of my research in one place because then I went on and ran record companies and archives and things like that afterwards. But sure, I think there are a number of us, and I was sort of thinking Rick's and my entire careers followed each other, from politics through graduate school, through going to very remote places, but to do interesting things, and then becoming involved by the canniness and sort of, I would say, sort of the intentionality and of the communities which we were to make us part of their plans for their own future. I think that happens a lot to anthropologists. Not all of them live up to the expectations of the communities that have tried to lasso them into being their white man or their representative.
Right.
But I think certainly part of doing research is other people have plans for you. And I think both Rick and I have experienced that.
But Tony, you worked with an indigenous population. I'm talking about those of us who have, done different kinds of things, and more anthropologists are doing the kinds of things that I do than what you guys have done. And that says something about changes in the field and all kinds of other things going on.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I think it's been true for a long time.
Yeah.
One difference that I found between my own experience and a lot of the even members of my cohort, the people who really made a reputation for themselves in anthropology were more often than not known for their theoretical work, and their theoretical work generally focused on one particular approach or one particular area. Working on a place like Anuta that had not been documented significantly by anybody before I went meant that anything that I wrote about them was new and potentially useful. So I've really kind of spread out and written on a wide variety of theoretical topics. And what really unites all of that for me more than anything else is the geographical focus on Anuta and a few other small Polynesian islands that are in some ways comparable to Anuta.
Any other questions?
Dave has had his hand up for the
Yes.
longest time.
Who? Dave?
Yes,
Go ahead.
Rick, fascinating presentation. And I am chronologically kind of a contemporary of yours, a couple of years younger, but not many. And so I followed, I had similar experiences in different ways, but I've actually written down probably about 7 questions, and I'm going to try to roll them into 1 or 2 at best. Most of them are related to directly related to your presentation. I think in one of them is kind of a tangential one that we may or may not get to. Some of them have already been sort of covered in your responses to your last questions, and I'll just as a preface, one of my dissertation advisors was a fellow named Paul Shankman, who did his dissertation research on American Samoa and remittances, and of course has written, as you probably are familiar, quite a bit about Margaret Mead. And so kind of the series of questions I was going to ask is, to what extent, even though Margaret Mead, of course, was sort of at least a generation behind most of us, but most of us may have had encountered it in one way or another, to what extent she influenced your field work and maybe even your theoretical interpretations, but mostly your field work approach. And then if it sounds like you must have studied the household economies on the island fairly extensively and tried to integrate that into some kind of an overall comprehensive understanding of how their economies operated. You did mention that they relied upon some cash from others outside who had migrated outside and then had remitted some cash back. And of course, that was Shankman's primary interest in American Samoa. I'm interested to what extent you integrated those two kinds of economic realities, if you will. And then another one that's not directly related, but I just want to throw it in there. To what extent, and I've looked online since you've been talking, this looks like a magnificently paradisical kind of a place. It just looks like paradise still today online, if it's at all accurate, what I'm looking at online. But to what extent climate change and the rising sea levels are impacting the peoples there? I know it's been an issue with a number of the Polynesian peoples. I'll stop there. I have some other questions, but I'll stop there.
Well, you're welcome to get in touch with me later on. So if I don't answer all of your questions now, I'm happy to talk or exchange emails. But
That's great.
a couple of thoughts. One, you mentioned Margaret Mead, and yes, Margaret Mead in many ways was a model for me. There are serious problems with her ethnography, but what she was trying to do, study people whose way of life is very different from those of us in the West, and to learn lessons which could then be applied to improve lives in the West, is really, more than anything else, probably what motivated me to go into anthropology. So in that way, I have tried to follow in her footsteps. And by the way, if you're in touch with Paul Shankman, give him my regards.
I will do that. And that's I appreciate that answer also regarding Margaret Mead.
Good. On climate change, Anuta is less affected than many others because, well, I describe it as a low-high island. It is not an atoll. It's a volcanic island that has a maximum altitude of about 200 feet, a little bit more. And it is really quite diverse in an ecological sense. It also doesn't really have a lagoon. Climate change has had some effect. There have been some devastating hurricanes, and maybe they're more devastating with climate change than they would have been otherwise. There is, in my opinion, from some swimming and diving that I've done in the area, some damage to the coral reef. But overall, issues like flooding or the damage to crops in low-lying areas because of salt contamination are far less of an issue in a place like Anuta than they are in an atoll community like, well, Tuvalu is probably the clearest case, an entire country that's made up of low-lying atolls. Tokelau would be another place that is an entire, it's not politically a country, but it is an entity that is made up of 3 atolls. Anuta is not susceptible to quite that extent. Oh, the issue of the cash economy. Could you tell me again what your question there was?
Just the kind of the interplay between cash remittances and the sustainable economy on the island, and how what the relative impact of each is, I guess.
Yeah. Bear in mind that I have not actually been to Anuta since 2013. So what I say may be a little out of date, but my impression is that the food that they get is almost entirely local. They grow dozens of different kinds of crops. They have lots of coconuts, lots of taro, lots of manioc, which is an imported crop, but it was well established. It's probably been well established there for a century or so. They have a number of other crops. Some of them are relatively recent imports. Others have been around for a long time, but they don't really have a problem most of the time. In the wake of a hurricane, they might. When I was first there in 1972, it was a few months after a major hurricane that destroyed an awful lot of the crops, and that was followed by a drought, so that it took a long time to recover. There actually was a hurricane maybe 15 years ago that did enough damage that the Anutans swallowed their pride and accepted some food assistance from outside the island. But that rarely occurs. Even in 1972, when there was a serious hurricane, and the colonial government offered food assistance, the Anutans turned it down because they didn't want to be dependent on anyone else. It's not entirely self-sufficient in the sense that people use metal knives, metal axes, things that they can't produce on their own island. But I compare even Anutan canoes with canoes on some other islands that I'm told are completely traditional. Then I look at those completely traditional canoes, and very often they're using things like monofilament line to lash the pieces together. At least my last visit to Anuta, they were using entirely local materials for their canoes. But there's a caveat there as well. They were using metal adzes and metal axes, and occasionally saws. And those are things that they can't produce on their own island.
I just would mention that George and Sharon Gamelch did some research. I don't know whether it was Sharon leading it or not in Alaska, and they were working with some native communities, and the members of the community didn't mind buying stuff from the outside, but they refused to buy food. And because they insisted that, they could hunt and fish the food that would sustain them. And that was, they took great pride in that, and that was their main focus. So they could fill up their freezers with food, and that allowed them to buy, with whatever money they had, the few things that they would need from the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's kind of like what's going on with Anuta, right?
Yeah, yeah. And then there are social issues connected with that. Again, this gets back into that notion of aropa and the responsibility of people in positions of leadership to take care of people at the lower levels of the social hierarchy. When I got to Anuta in '72, people were facing a potential famine. They didn't know how serious it was going to be. And the senior chief declared that from that time until the island had recovered, all of the food was going to be taken from the gardens of his clan to be distributed to all of the others. And then the junior chief and his clan said, well, we can't let you do that all by yourself. We're going to add our own resources. And then the two non-chiefly clans said, wait a minute, you can't do that for all the rest of us. We're going to make the entire island, all of the gardens belonging to all of the families and all of the clans into one cohesive unit. And when crops are harvested, we will share those crops with the entire community. The way the chief put it was that we don't know how serious this food shortage is going to be. We don't know if people are going to die from starvation, but if anybody dies of starvation, we're all going to die together. That was the attitude of people on Anuta toward food at that time. It was the basis of social solidarity, and social solidarity was what life was all about.
Sort of make Anuta great again.
Oh, I don't think that MAGA is likely to appear on Anuta, at least in the form that it has here.
Well, I think we should bring it to a close today. And thanks, Rick, very much for being on the hot seat today and talking to us. I just think it's wonderful that you took the time to talk to us.
Well, it's my pleasure. I thank you all for being here and for your attention.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Tim, for arranging another great one.
Okay, good. And I just want to remind you that on the November 3rd, we're going to have our annual business meeting on Zoom. And then I think it's December 1st or 2nd, Magdalena Segarra is going to talk on her work in senior homes in Lima, Peru, and how they survive or are left not to be taken care of by their family. So that's will be our last one for the for the fall, and then we'll have 5 in the spring. More about that later on. So thanks again to everybody, and thanks very, very much, Rick, for your wonderful talk. Really appreciate it. I'll have the recording made for this and post the thing on the our ASA listserv, so that others who weren't able to attend, several people have contacted me wanting to have the recording of today's talk. So I'll have that ready pretty soon. Okay.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks very
All
much,
right.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye now.